Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and on this channel I upload all sorts of different types of videos relating to true crime, education and psychology related topics. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you haven't already, then please do hit that subscribe button and don't forget to turn on your little notification bell so you know whenever I upload a new video. So welcome back to another instalment of my weekend uploads. If you haven't already seen, I'm uploading a new video every single day this week, so you'll get plenty of content from me, each one on a different true crime case. So if you haven't already watched the videos I've already uploaded this week, then definitely head over to my channel and watch all of those. You can have a nice binge watch of all of the cases. For today's video, I'm back discussing something known as the Santa Rosa hitchhiker killer case. So there's a number of murders that took place in the same sort of area, and we'll sort of be discussing each of the crimes and some potential theories, potential suspects. So if you want to hear about the case, then please do keep on watching. But before we get started, I am just going to zoom through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos. Just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet. And because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out, mispronounce things. I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and get started discussing the case of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker killer. So this case takes place in Sonoma County in Northern California, an area which was a highly sought after and popular area at the time in the early 1970s. At the time, the population of the county was half of what it is now, and it's also covered in the sort of vast areas of agriculture. There's a lot of land there. And because of these factors, it was considered a very picturesque county, something that was almost like the perfect example of the friendly small town America image. And Santa Rosa specifically was the largest city located in Sonoma County, where more than a quarter of the county's population were living. And the first person we're going to be focusing on in this video is a woman named Yvonne Lisa Weber. Yvonne was born on the 29th of January in the year of 1959 in Carson City, Nevada, but she moved to California when she was just a young child. When her parents divorced and her mother, Sheila, had married a man named David Harrington, Yvonne and her siblings lived with her mother and stepfather in Santa Rosa. She attended the local Herbert Slater Middle School, where she met a girl named Maureen Sterling, and the pair became inseparable. Maureen was slightly younger than Yvonne, but it wasn't an obvious age gap to others. In fact, many people would actually assume that Yvonne was the younger of the two. Maureen Sterling was born in Santa Rosa, and like I said, many people would just sort of assume that she was the older of the two friends, mainly because she was sort of the more confident and the outgoing one. She was naturally very outspoken and confident when talking to new people. And Maureen hadn't had the easiest of early lives, with her father passing away in a freak water skiing accident just a few months before she was born, when he was only 23 years old. And so her and her sister Teresa were raised by their single mother. In a lot of the sources that I read, Maureen was referenced to being outgoing and having an anti-authoritarian personality. And so this combined with her height, she was perceived as, like I said, being the oldest and the louder of the two friends. On Friday, the 4th of February 1972, 13-year-old Yvonne and 12-year-old Maureen had decided to meet up and go to the Redwood Empire Ice Arena, known by locals as Snoopy's Home Ice, which was an ice skating rink that was owned by the creator of the popular Peanuts comic strip. There were not a lot of places in the area for young kids to sort of spend their free time, to meet up with their friends, and so this ice rink in particular was popular and often rather busy, especially on a Friday evening. The two girls had been driven to the ice skating rink by one of their mothers, and they were dropped off at around 7:30 p.m. But when this same parent had returned to pick them up at around 11 p.m. as per their previous agreement, she found no sign of Yvonne or Maureen. She decided to head into the skating rink and look around, but when she still failed to locate either of the girls, she decided to ring the other mother in the hopes that they'd gone to her home after having left earlier than expected. But to her surprise, they weren't at the other's home, and the mothers immediately knew that something was wrong. They went to report the girls as being missing, as it just really wasn't like either of them to just wander off without telling their mothers where they were going. The following day, the Santa Rosa Police Department launched their investigation into the girls' disappearances. After collecting witness statements from the other individuals at the skating rink, the police determined that the last known sighting of Yvonne and Maureen had been at around 9 p.m. that previous evening, around an hour and a half after they'd been dropped off. And the two girls were seen getting into a vehicle on Gurneyville Road, located not far outside of the rink. And the witness had only had a passing view of this, and so they couldn't confidently determine whether the girls were willingly climbing into the car or not. But after learning that the two girls had hitchhiked together in the past, the police had assumed that this is likely what they had intended on doing. Police soon started receiving tips on potential sightings of the girls after this 9 p.m. sighting, with one witness in particular believing to have seen them in the Santa Rosa bowling alley later that same night. But when this particular sighting was chased up, authorities were unable to provide any proof that the girls had in fact been there that evening. There were also rumours that the girls had been seen talking to a local man that lived along the Russian River in the area, but once again, when this was chased up, they found no proof that the girls had been in contact with this particular man, nor had they been in that area. As they continued their search for the missing girls, they started their search in Santa Rosa and gradually moved further outwards towards Kenwood, Sugarloaf, Spring Lake and Howard Park areas, but they soon ran out of leads to follow and areas to search, as everything that they'd followed up appeared to lead nowhere. After 2 weeks passed and there was no sign of the girls, all potential leads and sightings appeared to stop, and it would seem as though the police had started to assume that the two girls had run away of their own free will and could one day just turn up. In hindsight, many people have criticised this assumption and the subsequent lack of press coverage aiding the search for the girls, because this case appeared to be somewhat forgotten about until later in the year when another incident occurred. And this following incident involved a young girl named Kim Wendy Allen. Kim was born on July the 22nd in 1952 and attended the all-girl Ursuline High School in Santa Rosa, where she lived with her parents and siblings. She was known to be a rather quiet person and wasn't overly outspoken with her opinions, but she was thought of very highly amongst her friends and family. In 1972, Kim was 19 years old and she was attending the Santa Rosa Junior College on an art course. She also worked part-time at a natural health food store in a town just south of Santa Rosa, and she also lived around the area of Gurneyville Road, the same area in which the last known sighting of Yvonne and Maureen had been. And Kim didn't live alone in that area. She had two roommates which she was somewhat close with. She also didn't drive, and in order for her to travel the 40-odd miles to work and to college, she would regularly hitchhike, something that her parents weren't particularly happy about, but she had continued to do despite their warnings. It seemed that a lot of people that knew Kim personally described her as having this belief in the good of every person that she came across, even strangers, and she would just assume that she could trust others to have only good intentions. And the last sighting of Kim Allen had been on the Saturday, the 4th of March in 1972. Kim had been in San Francisco visiting some friends and she needed to head back to her workplace in Larkspur for a shift that afternoon. So she had hitchhiked from San Francisco to Larkspur, where she arrived at her workplace just before midday. Her shift lasted for roughly around 5 hours and then she set off to hitchhike back to her home in Santa Rosa. She was picked up just outside of her workplace by two men who were travelling to San Rafael, and she agreed to join them in their journey since she could then once again hitchhike from San Rafael to Santa Rosa. These men dropped her off on Bell Avenue in San Rafael, and Kim planned on making the short walk to Highway 101's north side to then hitchhike home. She was known to be carrying a large wooden soy barrel engraved with Chinese characters, which she had picked up in San Francisco while she was with her friends, and she'd apparently had this plan to turn this soy barrel into a drum, and she was also carrying an aluminium framed orange backpack. Investigators later received several reports from drivers who had passed Kim that night, seeing her standing at the side of the road with her arm outstretched, attempting to hitchhike. But these would be the last known sightings of 19-year-old Kim Allen alive. No one knows where she went or what vehicle she had managed to get a lift in. The following day, the 5th of March at 2 p.m, a pair of local high school students had been riding motorcycles around the area of Bennett Valley Road when they stumbled across a body in an embankment. It was located at the bottom of the steep embankment on a creek bed not far from Enterprise Road. And when the authorities had arrived at the scene and inspected the remains, they believed that the victim had likely met with foul play and that the body had been thrown down the embankment by the perpetrator. The body was found without clothes and lying face down. She had been bound at the wrist and ankles with evidence of bruising underneath the ligatures. And these bruises had appeared to indicate that she had been bound tightly and that she'd struggled aggressively to free herself prior to her death. There were mixed reports of the wounds that the victim had sustained, but it's believed there had been evidence of a knife wound, although the extent of this wound wasn't made clear. It's reported that there had been evidence of a sexual assault prior to death, and the scene suggested that she had been assaulted and killed elsewhere. When the autopsy was carried out on the remains, cause of death was listed as asphyxia, and it was believed that she had been strangled with some type of wire or cord. But an extremely troubling finding had been that she had been slowly tortured for around half an hour prior to her losing consciousness. And because of this fact, her death was placed at being around midnight on March the 4th. DNA testing couldn't be used to test the evidence sample found that indicated a sexual assault, as DNA testing at that point wasn't advanced enough. Investigators had also found what was described as an oil-like substance on the right side of the remains, which had been described as being similar to car oil. And because no clothing or belongings were found at the scene aside from one gold hoop earring, it initially proved to be particularly difficult to identify this victim. 4 days after the discovery of this set of remains, Kim Allen's roommates decided to contact the local authorities, and they informed them that their missing roommate may be the victim that they found in the embankment. And the following day, the potential ID was confirmed when Kim's sister was called to identify the remains in person. When detectives had revisited the site where Kim's remains were found, they came across a slight impression in the ground at the top of the road overlooking the embankment that appeared to have been made by a leg. Upon closer inspection, it seemed that the perpetrator had likely slipped while they were throwing the victim's remains down the hill and had fallen down a short way themselves. And based on the angle of the fall, it was believed that they would have likely injured themselves in the process. They came across a potential suspect that same month when a 20-year-old local resident was arrested for sexually assaulting an 18-year-old student at the nearby Sonoma State Junior College while holding her at knife point. But after they investigated this individual, it was determined that they couldn't find any links to connect him specifically with Kim Allen's murder. Later that same month, a man named Robert Lee Bouchon was arrested for abducting a young woman in the area who had also been hitchhiking. Threatened her with a knife and had driven her back to his home, where he forced her to remove her clothes before then tying her up with ligatures. She had thankfully managed to escape the ordeal before being assaulted any further, as her attacker had proceeded to fall asleep next to her, giving her ample opportunity to escape his apartment. Just as with the previous suspect though, police were unable to connect this perpetrator with Kim Allen's murder specifically, but Bouchon did end up pleading guilty to kidnapping charges as a result of his crimes, and he was given prison time. Police continued to chase up their list of persons of interest and investigating them all individually, but ended up getting nowhere with their investigation. In the weeks following Kim Allen's death, her belongings were gradually found to appear in random areas at random times. The aluminium-framed orange backpack that she was known to have carried on her was found a few weeks later, followed by her checkbook in a different location. This checkbook specifically was found on March 24th inside a drive-up mailbox opposite the post office in a place called Kentfield in California. They later discovered a set of fingerprints on this checkbook, which they believed had likely belonged to her killer, but they were unable to match these prints with any of their suspects at the time. And then on the morning of April 25th, another disappearance occurred. This time it had been a 20-year-old woman named Jeannette Kamahele. Jeannette was born on the 19th of February 1952 from a Hawaiian heritage. Before living in the US, she had spent a large portion of her early life living in Japan because of her father being in the Navy. After graduating high school, Jeannette decided to move to the US and attend Santa Rosa Junior College, although she herself lived around 8 miles south of Santa Rosa itself. And just like Kim Allen, Jeannette would hitchhike daily to and from her classes, which had initially proven to be an easy and effective mode of transport for her. But then came the morning of Tuesday, April 25th, 1972, when Jeannette had left her home at around 9:30 a.m, heading out to make it to her first class of the day. She had told her roommate Nora that she was planning on hitchhiking to her class, but when she didn't return home later that night, Nora became particularly concerned. When Nora had contacted her college and discovered that Jeannette hadn't made it to any of her classes that day, and there remained no sign of her that same evening, Nora decided to contact the police to report her missing at just before midnight. The following day, an all-points bulletin was issued in order for the search for Jeannette to be extended, and the police's approach to Jeannette's disappearance had appeared to be slightly different from previous disappearances, as it was clear that it was unlikely for her to have been a runaway, since she was already living independently at this point and she didn't appear to be in any form of trouble. This, plus the knowledge of Kim Allen's case and the fact that Jeannette had too been hitchhiking that day, they already had considered the possibility of this disappearance being linked to the murder that had occurred the month prior. Investigators had attempted to narrow down some sightings of Jeannette prior to her disappearance in order to establish whether she had managed to travel anywhere and give them a location of where she was last seen. She was seen near the on-ramp of Highway 101 in the area where she would typically attempt to hitchhike to her classes. A friend of Jeannette's had actually been driving in the area and had spotted her that morning, and they'd claimed that they were planning on pulling up to her and offering her a lift, but before they could, another vehicle had already pulled up to Jeannette, and this vehicle had been described as being a 1950 to a 1952 pickup truck, which the witness had noticed a homemade faded brown wooden camper being placed on top of it. They described the driver as being a Caucasian male between 20 and 30 years old, with brown hair in an afro-style cut, and either thick sideburns or a dark beard. They also did note that the man appeared to be particularly tall based on the way that he was sat up in the driver's seat. Despite this description being provided by the witness, police didn't really have much luck finding this driver, and Jeannette Kamahele remains a missing person to this day. Her disappearance has not been confirmed to be connected to the killings of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker killer, but it is considered to be possibly linked / rather likely linked. On the 14th of December 1972, a set of remains were discovered in a ravine by a young couple on a walk passing Calistoga Road near Rincon Valley in Santa Rosa. Their report to the police of the discovery was received by the authorities at around 3:20 p.m. that day. When the police had arrived at the scene, they discovered the nude body of a woman that was completely frozen, giving them the impression that they had been in that location for quite some time. Just like Kim Allen's remains, this set of remains had been discarded down a steep embankment, and there had been no clothing or personal possessions found aside from a pair of earrings. Initial examinations of the remains had concluded that she died as a result of a broken vertebra in her neck, causing her to become paralysed, but when an extensive examination was conducted, it was discovered that she had a broken neck and extensive damage to her spinal cord. A conclusive cause of death could not be listed, but these were listed under her injuries. There appeared to be no sign of sexual assault, and her time of death was approximated at being between 1 and 2 weeks prior to the discovery of the remains. Authorities struggled to narrow down this time frame anymore because of the freezing conditions, but it was listed at being somewhere between the 1st and the 8th of December of that year. Initially, the victim had been estimated at being somewhere between 16 and 23 years old, but the day after the remains were discovered, authorities had managed to find an identity of the victim through dental records. It was determined that the victim found in the ravine had been Laurie Lee Cursor, born in February of 1959, making her only 13 years old at her time of death. Laurie was a student at the Lawrence Cook Middle School in Santa Rosa, and she had managed to gain quite a reputation of being a runaway even at her young age. She had on multiple previous occasions run away from home and not returned for days. She would usually stay at a friend's house in the area before then returning home. And despite being only 13 years old, she was also known to frequently hitchhike. She was reported missing on the 11th of November that year after Laurie had run away from her mother while the pair were inside a local grocery store. At the time, there were many rumours regarding her location, including that she would be at one of her friends' homes in the area, or that she had managed to travel to her father, who was living in Florida at the time. And exactly where she'd been planning on travelling to that day when she'd run away from her mother still remains unknown, although over the following few weeks there were alleged sightings of her with different friends in different areas nearby. So a last known sighting of Laurie could never be confirmed, as some of her friends had seen her just before Thanksgiving, whilst another had claimed to have seen her on November the 30th trying to hitchhike to Santa Rosa. Once Laurie had been identified as the remains found in the ravine in December, they started to consider possible scenarios that could have led to her death. They initially considered the possibility of her leaping from a moving vehicle in an attempt to escape some sort of attacker, but she hadn't then been aware of the steep drop just off the road, causing her to fall and break her neck. And then, not long after the public announcement of the discovery of Laurie's remains, a man contacted the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office to report an incident that he had witnessed just a few weeks prior. He placed the sighting at being somewhere between the 3rd and the 9th of December at around 9:30 p.m. whilst he was leaving work and heading home. According to this witness, he had seen a woman matching Laurie's description being walked out of an apartment building on Parkhurst Drive in Santa Rosa. She was being led to a white van parked across the street, and he recalled this van having a slightly different coloured door on the driver's side. He described this driver as being a Caucasian male with an Afro-style haircut, and there had been 2 other men who had been walking alongside the young woman, either directing her or forcing her towards this van, but he couldn't tell at the brief glance that he got. He said that as he looked closer, the 2 men appeared to have been holding the young woman up and hastened her towards the van before helping her or forcing her inside. The van then drove off in a northern direction in the direction of Calistoga Road, the same road where Laurie's remains were found a few days later. The witness couldn't recall any other specific details about the sighting aside from the van being an older model Ford brand which appeared dented in areas. After hearing of this incident, police began to theorise that a likely scenario had been that Laurie was kidnapped or coerced by a group of young men who had forced her to remove her clothing inside a van, and then she had leapt out of the vehicle at the first chance that she had gotten to escape. This theory obviously couldn't be confirmed, but it was a scenario that was considered as being likely based on the evidence that they had available at the time. The next incident believed to be linked to these cases occurred on Thursday, December the 28th, 1972. In an embankment just off of Franz Valley Road, the remains of 2 children were discovered by a pair of teenagers hiking through an area known as the Devil's Kitchen. The remains had been heavily decomposed at the time of discovery, and the authorities had relatively quickly linked this discovery to the disappearance of 13-year-old Yvonne Weber and 12-year-old Maureen Sterling earlier that year. And this suspicion would soon be confirmed through a comparison of dental records. The 2 missing girls were discovered 10 months after their disappearance. And just like the previous discoveries, the remains were found without clothes and no sign of any of the belongings the pair were known to have on them at the time of their disappearance. The only things found at the scene had been a select few jewellery pieces discovered at the top of the embankment overlooking where the remains had been found. Maureen's mother had later been able to confirm that these jewellery items, which had been a necklace with a crucifix, some orange beads and a single earring, had belonged to their daughter. Because of the condition of the remains, it had been proven to be particularly difficult for the authorities to determine exactly how and when the pair had died. But following the announcement of their identification, the local police department started to receive a lot of negative press regarding their initial lack of investigation into their disappearances while operating on the assumption that the pair were runaways. It is worth noting just here that at the time of these cases taking place, hitchhiking itself was a relatively frequent occurrence, as well as the number of assault reports being filed as a result of hitchhiking being relatively common. And during this period of time, authorities did have a number of other cases to investigate as potentially being linked, but these that I've covered are specifically the ones that the authorities believed at the time to have been linked to one another based on the evidence that they collected. On the 31st of July 1973, a motorcyclist had been travelling along Franz Valley Road in Sonoma County, which passed through sort of an area of forest. As he drove through the area by the side of a small road for a while, he noticed this overpowering smell emanating from somewhere nearby. He He briefly attempted to see if he could locate the source of the smell, but when he couldn't, he decided to drive off and later called the police reporting this strange finding. And the authorities had arrived at the scene later that evening, and they soon realised that that had been the exact same spot where they responded to a finding which led to the discovery of the remains of Yvonne and Maureen the previous December. As they searched the west side of the road, they discovered a set of human remains down the embankment, another young woman who had been found without clothes. She was estimated at being between 14 and 16 years old, with blondish brown hair and being around 5'7" tall. And this set of remains was found less than 3 feet away from where the bodies of the 2 young girls were found just 8 months before. An early examination of the remains determined that she had been in that location for anywhere between a week and 72 hours prior to the discovery, and they hadn't been able to pinpoint an exact cause of death. A re-examination led to the conclusion that she had died more specifically between 10 and 14 days before being found. And they also couldn't determine whether she had been sexually assaulted prior to death, but a small hole was found in her right ear which looked to be a similar size to like an ear piercing hole, but it seemed as though it hadn't been completely pierced through. It was considered that this may have been done prior to having come in contact with her killer, but there hadn't been a matching hole in her other ear. It was eventually decided by the authorities that this small wound would be listed as being part of the decomposition process, and they just chose not to look into it any further. They struggled to use this victim's physical appearance or fingerprints to obtain an identity due to the condition of the remains, but they collected dental records in the hopes of starting their search for a name. And then, after a description of the victim was released to local news outlets, the police were contacted by a local woman who believed that this victim may have been her younger sister. And this potential identity would end up being an exact match. They had discovered the remains of 15-year-old Carolyn Davis. Carolyn Nadine Davis was born on the 3rd of December 1957 and spent the majority of her life in the Northern California area. On the 6th of February 1973 at around 7 a.m, Carolyn set out from her parents' home wearing a brown jacket with a fur collar and blue jeans, and she was heading to school. Carolyn was never seen again following this point, and it appeared as though she had intentionally skipped school. When there remained no sign of her later that same evening, her parents had reported her as missing. Her parents at the time had initially believed that she may have run away from home, possibly travelling towards San Diego, and over the following months there were reports coming in claiming that this young girl had been spotted all over the country. Just a few weeks after her disappearance, Carolyn's parents received a letter from their daughter, and it was postmarked from a place called Soledad in California. And in the letter, she informed them that she had in fact run away and that she wasn't planning on coming home. As authorities had started tracking down her known movements across the country, it was known that just 2 weeks before the discovery of her body on July the 15th, Carolyn had visited her grandmother in Garberville. And this area was around 150 miles outside of Santa Rosa, and it's known that since her leaving home, she'd gotten everywhere by hitchhiking. When Carolyn had arrived at her grandmother's home, she stayed with her for around 2 weeks before she wanted to set off again and start travelling. And her grandmother last saw her at 1 p.m. on the 15th of July 1973 when she dropped the young girl off outside the local police office. She then saw Carolyn walking in the direction of the Highway 101 on-ramp where she'd been planning on hitchhiking and travelling south to visit some of her friends. It took a couple weeks after the discovery of her body for the authorities to determine a cause of death, and they determined that it had been something called strychnine poisoning. I apologise if I mispronounced that. Strychnine is typically used as a pesticide, and it's extremely deadly to humans if it's ingested or inhaled. And it's not known for certain exactly how Caroline was poisoned, as her remains were too decomposed at the time of discovery. But authorities had theorised that this poisoning had been another form of torture used by the same perpetrators as the previous murders, as strychnine poisoning is extremely painful and it causes hours of muscle spasms and seizures. In terms of evidence though, investigators were struggling to find enough to prove that Carolyn Davis's death was actually linked to the others, as there appeared to be no connection and the cause of death was something entirely different. Something unusual about the site of Carolyn Davis's remains though had been the discovery of a witchcraft symbol, allegedly meaning carrier of spirits. It had been in the shape of a rectangle connected to a square with lines running along each side, all made of like twigs and sticks. And this is just something that I'm touching on briefly, but I will go into a little bit more detail later on in the video. But then on Friday, December the 28th, 1973, police were called to a scene just north of Santa Rosa in Mark West Creek. A pair of teenagers had been out in the creek that afternoon on their kayaks when they'd stumbled across the naked body of a young woman, half in the water, being held in place by a large log. As it would turn out, the victim had been hogtied by her killer before her death, and they'd used a thin piece of clothesline rope to hold her limbs together. Thumbs in particular had been tied together so tightly that they'd started to lose circulation and they'd started turning purple. Possibly the most traumatic finding of the investigators had been this next method of torture that she was subjected to. They'd found a noose made of rope that attached her throat directly to her ankles while she was hog-tied, and because of this noose, she would have to keep her legs and body in a tensed, flexed position in order to allow herself to continue breathing. And this is something that's virtually impossible to do over an extended period of time until she could no longer hold the position and passed away. Her time of death was initially placed at being anywhere between 2 days and a week before the discovery of her body, and it had proven difficult for the authorities to establish exactly where the remains had entered the water, as the current could have moved them a significant portion over time. So they proceeded to search areas alongside the creek to potentially find any areas where the killer could have driven up and dumped the remains. It was later determined that the week before the discovery, the water levels in the creek had been a lot higher, meaning that the remains could have travelled quite some distance in that time frame, and when they traced the potential routes backwards, they came to locations very close to where some of the other remains were found. Similarly to the other victims as well, the victim appeared to have had her ears pierced in the past, but there were no signs of her earrings at the scene. The autopsy confirmed that the victim had died as a result of being strangled by the noose that had been fastened around her neck and attached to her ankles, but she had also suffered a blow to the back of the head as well as a large bruise being around her left eye, suggesting that there had been some form of assault. And when they went to collect dental imprints, they discovered that she had an entire set of false upper teeth as well as a silver crown in the lower right of her mouth, and this specific dental work then proved vital to discovering the identity of this unknown victim. 23-year-old Teresa Diane Smith Walsh, usually referred to as Terry, went missing in December of 1973. It's known that she grew up just north of Garberville, where her mother would end up living, and at the time of her disappearance, she was married with a toddler. In some reports that I read, they specified that in early 1973, Teresa had decided to leave her husband and she travelled across California by hitchhiking. She was last seen at Zuma Beach near Malibu on the 22nd of December 1973, meaning that her body was found over 400 miles away from where she was last seen. Teresa had been staying with some friends at the time and told them that she was considering hitchhiking to Garberville in order to spend Christmas with her family. And this route would have likely taken her through Santa Rosa, so it's believed that she had ended up in that area before then attempting to catch another ride for the rest of the journey. When there was no sign of Teresa over Christmas, her mother reported her as missing on New Year's Eve, which was 3 days after the discovery of her remains near Santa Rosa. And because of this missing persons report being filed, she was added to the list of potential identifications, before this then being confirmed by the dental records. Despite their attempts to track down the killer through what they did have available to them from the crime scene, such as the nylon rope, the identity of the serial offender continued to escape them. On July the 2nd, 1979, a set of skeletal remains were discovered in a ravine around 100 yards away from where the remains of Laurie Lee Cursor were discovered. Because of the state of decomposition the remains were in, authorities had initially believed that they had found the body of missing Jeannette Kamahale, but when the dental imprints were compared, they discovered that they weren't a match. This victim had been hogtied just as Teresa Walsh had been, and she was found to have suffered a fractured arm. Her remains had been found forced inside of a large bag, possibly a duffel or a laundry bag, and then thrown into the ravine. Authorities had not had enough information to establish a confirmed cause of death, but they placed her at being somewhere between 16 and 21 years old. She had on her a metal tin with cherries printed on it that was used to store her contact lenses, and she had reddish-brown hair with a previously healed rib break. No clothing was found on or near the remains, and they had placed her death at being somewhere between 1972 and 1974, but they hadn't been able to narrow down this time frame. Another case that was considered as being possibly linked but not confirmed had been that of 17-year-old Lisa Michelle Smith. Lisa was last seen hitchhiking near Hearn Avenue in Santa Rosa around the time of March the 16th, 1971, and she was never seen again. An article published in the following month in a local newspaper had printed an alleged sighting of Lisa apparently hitchhiking to San Francisco, and then not long after being picked up by a male driver. And there was also an article published that claimed Lisa had reported being seen jumping out of a moving pickup truck just outside of Novato in California after the driver had threatened her with a gun and said that he was going to sexually assault her. She was then allegedly treated at the Novato General Hospital but ran out before anyone could take her statement, and she then allegedly hitchhiked back to San Francisco. This article claims she was then found by her biological parents, who took her back to her home in Livermore in California. But in terms of the reliability of this report, it remains unknown, as the vast majority of reports state that she was never seen after she first went missing. Another case considered to be possibly linked is that of 15-year-old Kerry Ann Graham and 14-year-old Francine Marie Trimble. The two young girls had disappeared from Forestville in 1978, and their skeletal remains were found the following summer in Mendocino County, just off the side of a highway. At first, the remains were not identified as being that of Kerry and Francine, but in 2015, an updated method of DNA analysis provided the unknown victims with their identities. It was believed that these two girls were last seen by a school friend while they were stood outside of their school smoking, and it's known that they didn't attend their classes that day. They had told the friend that they were planning on hitchhiking to Santa Rosa, where they were going to a party, but they hadn't specified whose party it was or who they were meeting there. Another friend had allegedly then seen them at a gas station in Forestville attempting to hitchhike, but the exact date and time of this could never be confirmed by the authorities. Francine's mother had told the authorities that she didn't believe the girls had run away, and her daughter had told her that she even had plans to do some Christmas shopping with her in the following few days. No one appeared to know any more details about the location of this party that the girls were allegedly planning on going to, or who else would be there. But the investigation into the girls' disappearance appeared to not be too extensive initially, as Kerry wasn't even reported as an official missing person until decades after she went missing, and local authorities seemed to just assume that they'd run away from home together and that they would one day just return. In terms of their remains, it was difficult for authorities to determine a cause of death, but they did find small pieces of duct tape near the remains, and because of this, authorities had considered the possibility that the girls may have been bound. A single earring was also found at the scene, which was later confirmed to have belonged to Kerry, but aside from this, no other personal belongings were discovered. In 1973, the FBI had announced in an official report that there were 14 murders in the span of 2 years between 1972 and 1974 that they believed were carried out by the same murderer. Including the known victims that I've listed, they also listed the following as being connected. 20-year-old Rosa Vasquez, who was last seen on May the 26th, 1973. 3 days later, her remains were found at one of the entrances to the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco after having been thrown into some bushes from a busy road. Yvonne Kilantang, who was 15 years old, and she was found murdered in a vacant lot in Bayview in June of 1973 whilst she was 7 months pregnant. 16-year-old Angela Thomas was found smothered in a playground in Daly City on July the 2nd, 1973. 24-year-old Nancy Patricia Gidley was last seen at the Roadway Inn Motel in July of 1973, and then 3 days later her remains were found behind a local high school, and she was found without any clothes apart from one single earring. 22-year-old Nancy Fusey went missing in 1973 after going out to a club one evening in Sacramento, and her remains were found in July of that same year. 21-year-old Laura Odell disappeared on the 4th of November 1973, and her remains were found in some bushes 3 days later at Stowe Lake in Golden Gate Park. She was found to have had her hands bound behind her back, and she appeared to have suffered both blows to the head and strangulation. 19-year-old Brenda K. Merchant had been attacked and killed inside her Marysville home on February the 1st, 1974. And finally, there was 14-year-old Donna M. Braun, whose remains were found on September the 29th, 1974 in the Salinas River, located not far from Monterey, and she was found to have been strangled. In all of these cases in particular, the causes of death did differ slightly, as some were established as being strangulation, whilst others were found to have been stabbed or beaten, but it was found, or at least determined by the FBI, that each of these cases did fit the general MO of this one killer that they believed they were looking for. Following the witness who had believed that he'd seen a young girl who looked similar to Laurie Cursor being dragged away by multiple men, the investigators had looked into the possibility of this Santa Rosa hitchhiker killer actually being more than one person. However, after a psychological profile was pieced together a few years later, it was announced that they believed they were likely dealing with one individual who was responsible for each of these attacks. If you think back to earlier on in the video, in 2 separate cases there were witnesses who had reported seeing a Caucasian man with a Afro-style haircut as being in the area as the last known sightings of 2 of the victims. And so this would definitely be something that cannot be ignored in terms of the investigation. But now I thought I'd go into some of the theorised suspects, some individuals that have been considered as maybe being linked, because in reality, this killer remains unknown. The most obvious of theorised suspects, because of the time in which these murders had occurred as well as the location, had been the Zodiac Killer. In order to delve deeply into this theory, I would have to make an entire video on the Zodiac Killer's crimes themselves, but for the sake of this video, I thought I would just go over some of the similarities that led to this mysterious killer being considered a possible suspect, and I'll leave some good coverage of the Zodiac Killer's crimes in the description so you can actually watch that and understand the killer itself if you aren't already familiar. As I said, the time and location had played a huge part in the Zodiac Killer becoming a suspect, but also the unusual symbol that was found at the site of Carolyn Davis's remains had led a lot of people to believe that he may have been linked, since he was known for leaving puzzles relating to his crimes and cryptic messages. Some had also believed that the unknown symbol that the Zodiac Killer had left on what's known as the Exorcist letter, which was sent to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1974, had seemed to bear some resemblance to the Chinese characters that were found on the barrel being carried by Kim Allen when she was last seen, which had also never been found. And in that same letter, the Zodiac Killer had also claimed to have amassed a total of 37 victims, but he was only known to have been linked to 5. In 1969, he had also sent a letter to the same newspaper claiming that he was planning on switching up the MO of his murders so that they shall look like routine robberies, killings of anger, and a few fake accidents, etc. And the subsequent Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders would be just that, a complete change in MO for the Zodiac Killer if he were the one responsible. And the next potential suspect in the case is closely linked to the Zodiac Killer theory, as he is considered as being one of the main suspects regarding the identity of the Zodiac Killer. Arthur Lee Allen had owned a trailer home in Sunset Trailer Park in Santa Rosa at the time of these killings. In 1968, his employment in an elementary school was terminated following claims of child molestation, and around the same time he was also a student at the Sonoma State University. He was ultimately arrested in 1975 on an unrelated child molestation charge and sent to a state hospital until 1977. And in terms of the Zodiac killings, the DNA didn't act in support of him being the killer, but it could be more likely that he was in fact the Santa Rosa hitchhiker killer, especially due to the fact that the vast majority of the victims were underage girls. There had also been trace evidence linking Allen to some of the Santa Rosa victims, including hairs found on some of the victims that matched hairs found in the boot of his car. These hadn't been human hairs, but rather chipmunk hairs, and it is possible that this had simply been a coincidence, but it is also something to consider, as it's a seemingly unusual thing to link them. Again, because of the time and location of these attacks, there was also a Ted Bundy theory developed. Ted Bundy's MO wasn't entirely different from what a lot of the Santa Rosa victims had suffered, and Bundy had claimed to have raped and killed at least 27 other victims than the ones authorities were aware of, and since he was known to operate not too far from Santa Rosa, it isn't entirely impossible. But over the years, authorities had been able to examine things like credit card records, which showed that at the time of a lot of the disappearances and murders taking place, he was in Washington, although it has been argued that it is entirely possible for him to travel to and from Santa Rosa in the days in between the receipts that in Washington. two men known as the Hillside Stranglers of Los Angeles, who were Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bueno Jr., were also considered briefly as being suspects at one point in this investigation. There had also been an incident involving a man named Frederick Manali. He was a 41-year-old creative writing instructor at the Santa Rosa Junior College. On August 24th, 1976, he died as a result of being in a head-on collision on Highway 12 in California. And amongst his belongings, police had found a number of sadomasochistic drawings that depicted a girl that looked a lot like Kim Wendy Allen, who was a former student of his and also one of the Santa Rosa victims. As of today, the case of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders remain unsolved and the killer remains unidentified. In 2011, the DNA evidence collected in the original investigation was revisited and filed in CODIS, which was a national DNA database. And then in 2018, the same DNA evidence was revisited in order for it to be retested using sort of more advanced technology in the hopes of discovering the killer's identity. But until there are more updates, this is where I'm going to end today's video. So as always, please do leave your thoughts down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting and I'll see you guys tomorrow for another case. Thanks for watching. Bye.